Time for the second passage of test number 3. Let's get started. First question, what function does the third paragraph serve in the passage as a whole? I like that it's specific, but the reference in the question to the passage as a whole indicates that this might actually be kind of general. So I'm going to skip that for now. Which choice does the author explicitly cite as an advantage of automobile traffic in North America? So this looks like a keyword type question. Not quite sure where the answer might be to that yet. We'll skip it. We'll also skip the part 2 that follows up. What is the central idea of the fourth paragraph? So we will make our way to this fourth paragraph, which is quite long. And along the way, if we come to an answer for even 11 or 12 or 13, we'll stop and do those. But let's just start reading. So this passage is adapted from this book. Though there are 600 million cars on the planet and counting, there are also 7 billion people, which means that for the vast majority of us, getting around involves taking buses, ferry boats, commuter trains, streetcars, and subways. In other words, traveling to work, school, or the market means being a strap hanger, somebody who, by choice or necessity, relies on public transport rather than a privately owned automobile. Half the population of New York, Toronto, and London do not own cars. Public transport is how most of the people of Asia and Africa, the world's most populous continents, travel. Every day, subway systems carry 155 million passengers, 34 times the number carried by all the world's airplanes, and the global public transport market is now valued at $428 billion annually. A century and a half after the invention of the internal combustion engine, private car ownership is still an anomaly. And yet, public transportation in many minds is the opposite of glamour. A squalid last resort for those with one too many impaired driving charges, too poor to afford insurance, or too decrepit to get behind the wheel of a car. In much of North America, here's a key word, they are right. Taking transit is a depressing experience. Anybody who has waited far too long on a street corner for the privilege of boarding a lurching, overcrowded bus, or wrestle luggage onto subways and shuttles to get to a big city airport, knows that transit on this continent tends to be underfunded, ill-maintained, and ill-planned. Given the opportunity, who wouldn't drive? Hopping in a car almost always gets you to your destination more quickly. So going back to 12, because I think we can answer this now. What is the advantage of automobile travel? Basically, it's convenient. It gets you to your destination quickly, right? We can see in these lines in specific, lines 33 to 34 or 32 to 34, and it's better than public transportation, which has all these downsides. So environmental impact doesn't mention anything. In fact, if you know from outside knowledge, automobile traffic is terrible for the environment, but again, more importantly, not mentioned in the passage. Convenience, that might be good. We'll come back to it. Speed, that was also mentioned. Cost doesn't mention that. In fact, says that one of the reasons why more people don't drive is that, it costs money to get insured and so on and so forth. So now we're stuck between B and C, and we have to make very sure that whichever one is the answer was mentioned in the passage. Now, speed was definitely mentioned, right, in these lines, so 32 to 34. So I'm pretty happy with C, but let's just make sure convenience wasn't mentioned as a specific advantage of automobile travel. So taking transit is depressing. So all we see in this paragraph is that public transportation has these problems, right? It's overcrowded, it's underfunded, ill-maintained, ill-planned, so perhaps inconvenient, but it doesn't specifically say driving in cars, automobile travel is convenient. You might be able to infer it, but you got to make a number of logical steps, and it's much clearer here that they mention speed, so we're going to go with C. Looking at our follow-up question, D looks pretty solid. It's the citation we picked out. Let's just double-check these references. 5 to 9. This just says that people tend to rely on public transport, so we'll get rid of A. 20 to 24, again, talks about why people take public transport. 24 to 26 talks about how public transport is depressing, so the only one that really talks about cars specifically is D, so we like D. This fourth paragraph we read, we didn't read the fourth paragraph, we read the third paragraph. I might be able to answer it, but I'm going to hold off on it because I want to finish the passage and then we'll come back to it. The central idea of the fourth paragraph. So let's read this fourth paragraph, find the central idea. It doesn't have to be like this. Done right, public transport can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. In Shanghai, German-made magnetic levitation trains skim over elevated tracks at 266 miles an hour, whisking people to the airport at a third of the speed of sound. In provincial French towns, electric-powered streetcars run silently on rubber tires, sliding through narrow streets along a single guide rail set into cobblestones. From Spain to Sweden, Wi-Fi-equipped high-speed trains seamlessly connect with highly ramified metro networks, allowing commuters to work on laptops as they prepare for same-day meetings in once-distant capital cities. In Latin America, China, and India, working people board fast-loading buses that move like subway trains along dedicated busways, leaving the sedans and SUVs of the rich mired in dawn-to-dusk traffic jams. And some cities have transformed their streets into cycle path freeways, making giant strides in public health and safety and the sheer livability of their neighborhoods, in the process turning the workaday bicycle into a viable form of mass transit. So what's the central idea of this paragraph? Seems what we saw right here, right? Public transport can be awesome. Here are some examples of how public transport is awesome in other places. So, European countries excel at public transportation. Be very careful. This is a central idea question. This is kind of a primarily trap where, sure, they do mention that, Spain to Sweden, they have some good public transportation, but that's not the central idea because they also mention Latin America, China, and India, which aren't European. And so this is part of what's going on here, but it's not the whole. So we can get rid of A. Some public transportation systems are superior to travel by private automobile. Maybe, but again, it might be kind of an issue with A, the same kind of problem. Some public transportation systems are superior to travel by private automobile. No, I guess the real issue is this. Does it really say that it's superior? No, all it says, well, on the other hand, going back to these lines, it kind of does, right? Done right, public transportation can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. That actually might work now that I reread this and I look at my underlined portion. And here would be some examples about some excellent public transport. Might work, so let's hold off on B. Americans should mimic foreign public transportation systems when possible. So even though they're saying that these systems are great, it doesn't say specifically that, number one, Americans should mimic public or foreign public transportation systems, nor does it say that it should mimic them. It's just giving examples of good systems that work. It doesn't specifically say Americans should copy it, so we can get rid of C. Much international public transportation is engineered for passengers to work while on board. Again, they do mention this, line 46, but it's the same problem as A. It's only partial of what's going on in the paragraph. B captures the paragraph as a whole much better, so we'll go with B. Notice that 15 points to, is a two-part question, and I like 35 to 37 because that's my underlined portion. We'll just check the rest of the choices. Line 35, it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't say anything about, it gets into a little bit about how public transportation in North America isn't great, but we want a more specific answer, which B gives us. 37 to 40, this just gives us an example of a great piece of public transportation, not general enough. Same thing with 44 to 48. This is the trap choice that would go with D, right? D is about working on your public transport. 44 to 48 talks about working on public transport. So if you pick D in 14, you would have probably picked D in 15, and that's the trap. But the answer to this one's going to be B. As used in line 58, credit most nearly means. So here's credit. If you credit the demographers, this transit trend has legs. The millennials, who reached adulthood around the turn of the century and now outnumber baby boomers, tend to favor cities over suburbs and are far more willing than their parents to ride buses and subways. Okay, let's hold off. If you credit the demographers, this transit trend has legs. The millennials who reached adulthood. Okay, so basically, if you, good word here, believe the demographers, right? If you think the demographers know what they're talking about, you would credit this transit boom to the changes in demography, to the growth of these millennials. So believe looks pretty good, and in fact, C looks like it fits perfectly. Endow and credit doesn't really make any sense. Endow means to bestow or award a certain thing to somebody, like money or a prize or something, and that doesn't really fit. Attribute, if you attribute the demographers, this is one of those cases where when you plug this in, it doesn't really make sense. If you attribute the demographers, you can't really attribute people. if you honor the demographers, nothing here says that we're honoring them. So the only one that works in context and works when you plug it in, right? If you believe the demographers, this transit trend has legs. Seems to make sense. So we're going to go with choice C. As used in line 61, favor most nearly means. So they tend to favor cities over suburbs. So maybe a word like prefer, right? They want to live in cities rather than suburbs. And again, I'm picking these words out not because I've looked at the choices, just because can read in context and see what word makes the most sense. So indulge doesn't work, resemble doesn't work, serve doesn't work. Best choice here is B. Which choice best supports the conclusion that public transportation is compatible with the use of personal electronic devices? We read this before. Although, no, this looks like it's from 59 to 81, so let's skip this. We'll come back to it. The last two questions are figure questions. We're going to leave those. Let's finish reading, and let's try to find this portion about the electronic devices. Part of the reason is their ease with iPads, MP3 players, Kindles, and smartphones. You can get some serious texting done when you're not driving, and earbuds offer effective insulation from all but the most extreme commuting annoyances. Even though there are more teenagers in the country than ever, only 10 million have a driver's license versus 12 million a generation ago. Baby boomers may have been raised in Leave It to Beaver suburbs, but as they retire, a significant contingent is favoring older cities and compact towns where they have the option of walking and riding bikes. Let's stop there. We have our answer, right? It's from 63 to 67, which looks like choice B. We'll double check 59 to 63. Doesn't say anything about personal electronic devices. 68 to 70 doesn't either. 77 to 81, just skimming it quickly, doesn't. So B is the answer. Let's finish reading the passage, then we'll go back and do 11. Seniors, too, are more likely to use transit, and by 2025, there will be 64 million Americans over the age of 65. Already, dwellings in older neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Denver, especially those near light rail or subway stations, are commanding enormous price premiums over suburban homes. The experience of European and Asian cities shows that if you make buses, subways, and trains convenient, comfortable, fast, and safe, a surprisingly large percentage of citizens will opt to ride rather than drive. Okay, so let's go back and answer 11. What was the function of the third paragraph? So this was the one talking about how public transportation in North America was terrible. So I guess it's just giving us some context about public transportation being terrible in North America. It acknowledges that a practice favored by the author of the passage has some limitations. We'll keep this for now. Maybe I'll put a squiggly because on some level, yes, right? The idea that public transportation can sometimes be terrible might indicate that public transportation has limitations. It doesn't exactly fit with my original guess, so I'm a little wary of this choice, but let's see what else we've got and then we'll evaluate. It illustrates with detail the arguments made in the first two paragraphs of the passage. This does not illustrate the arguments or the points made in the first two paragraphs, so we'll get rid of B. It gives an overview of a problem that has not been sufficiently addressed by the experts mentioned in the passage. Again, doesn't really mention that specifically. If anything, just the opposite, right? Because public transportation in other countries have kind of solved these problems, so we can probably get rid of that. It advocates for abandoning a practice for which the passage as a whole provides mostly favorable data. No, it's not advocating abandoning public transportation. So as it turns out, A looks like just the only one left. It's going to be our best answer. So even though it wasn't perhaps the best choice, it wasn't certainly what I predicted, I think it works out actually, yes, being the best choice when we look at the other four choices, or the other three choices, right? Because, and yeah, we are getting some idea that, look, listen, public transportation has some problems. Sometimes it's better to use a car. So it is kind of giving us some idea of the limitations of public transport. So we'll go with A for this one. Let's now wrap up with the graph questions. Which choice is supported by the data in the first figure? So for this, let's go to the choices and see which fits. The number of students using public transportation is greater than the number of retirees using public transportation. So we have to be careful with this, right? Here is the description of who uses it, but this is just the primary occupation of public transportation passengers in U.S. cities. We see that students is at 10.7 and retirees is 6.7. So you might say, oh, 10.7 is bigger than 6.7. But Maybe that doesn't work actually, right? Because let's say you had 1,000 people using public transport, then 107 students would be using it, and 67 retirees would be using it. So this actually might work. So let's hold off on this. The number of employed people using public transportation and the number of unemployed people using public transportation is roughly the same. Doesn't really look possible, right? Here's 72% for employed, at least. Here's 6.4% at least for unemployed. 72% is the majority, so we can definitely get rid of B. People employed outside the home are less likely to use public transportation than our homemakers. So just because, well, if anything, looks like it's more likely, but in any event, we can't really compare the likelihood. Nothing in this graph says anything about the likelihood of using public transportation. Here's the limitations of knowledge here, right? The limits of knowledge. All we know is that 72% of the passengers on these public transport are people outside the home, and 2% are homemakers. We have no idea about the likelihood because we can't compare the raw numbers of those two. So we can get rid of C. Unemployed people use public transportation less often than do people employed outside the home. Again, the percentage is lower, but we can't compare likelihood. This graph says nothing about likelihood, so we're going to go with A. Last question, 20. Taken together, the two figures suggest that most people who use public transportation are what? Well, notice when we look at this, the purpose of the trips, the majority of the purpose of the trips are for work. The majority of the people who use these public transportation things are employed outside the home. So it looks like the answer is going to have something to do with work. Are employed outside the home and take public transportation to work. Perfect. Are employed outside the home but take public transportation primarily in order to run errands. That looks like this category, 6.3. That's not enough. Use public transportation during the week but use their private car on weekends. Neither of these say anything about when it's being used. So again, limits of knowledge. We don't know anything about that based on the graphs. Use public transportation only until they are able to afford to buy a car. Maybe that's true. I mean, it could be true, but no evidence at all of that in the graphs. So we'll go with A. And we'll just double check. Looks like we finished all of them. Let's move on to passage 3.